Okay, well, welcome everybody. This is Who Pays? The Health and Economic Impacts of Fracking in Pennsylvania. And just a couple logistics things to start with. We have a schedule where we will first be doing basic introductions, and I will introduce the authors who will be speaking through videos that summarize the 2 reports that Delaware Riverkeeper Network has commissioned. And each of those videos lasts, the first one 10 minutes and the second one 20 minutes. After the 2 videos, we will go to questions and answers, and we have about 15 minutes for that. During the videos, you can type in your questions as you listen to the videos into the chat box at the bottom of your screen. And then we will take the questions off the chat box and we will ask them of our presenters. And our presenters will be a representative of each of the organizations that produce the reports, and I'll introduce them when we get there. And then at the end we have just a short time where we'll introduce a couple concepts for action. When we have forums further into Pennsylvania where fracking is occurring, that section of our forum will last a longer time and be interactive. But today, this webinar is not interactive, so we're not able to have that portion, but we will share a couple ideas. So I hope that covers the basic logistics. We did commission these 2 reports that we're going to be hearing about today. The first one is the Categorical Review of Health Reports on Unconventional Oil and Gas Development Impacts in Pennsylvania. That's by Fracking Alliance. And the second report is the Economic Cost of Fracking in Pennsylvania, and that's by ECO Northwest, and we have representatives of each of them. So since 2008, fracking has increased in Pennsylvania, as we all know. And in many ways, it's come to define the areas with the activities that shale gas extraction and processing, delivery, and the end use of fracking requires. We hear an awful lot about the benefits of natural gas from the industry, and of course government entities as well that support that, such as the ads on TV and the radio ads that claim that natural gas is a boon for Pennsylvania. And also we have many public officials that are elected in the Pennsylvania legislature and other government bodies that support fracking. And so fracking and having fracking continue as well. Some of them are even attempting at this moment to relax current regulations to aid and support increased growth of fracking. And of course the end uses are expanding as markets are invented by the industry to try to get rid of all the gas that they're producing. But communities that are in the midst of fracking and its activities live in a very different world than that's painted by what we usually hear of the benefits, quote unquote, of fracking. And they live in the midst of all the activities that are associated with the development of shale gas and oil in Pennsylvania. And mostly we'll be discussing today the health impacts and then the economic impacts associated with the myriad of activities that are required by unconventional oil and gas development. And we'll be looking at those locally, and we'll also be looking at them statewide in terms of economics and health. So these reports attempt to take a look at those 2 areas, health and economics of fracking, and experts from Fracking Alliance analyze the scientific and academic papers and studies. They look at the ones that have been published over the past 3 years on the health effects of fracking. And experts from ECO Northwest evaluate the health, community, and environmental cost of fracking in Pennsylvania from an economic point of view. So I'll introduce those who will be speaking after the videos, but right now I'd like to introduce who you're going to see on the video. The first video is from Fracking Alliance, and her name is Erica Jackson. She's a community outreach and communication specialist. She's researched emissions and health impacts from unconventional oil and gas development and environmental justice concerns regarding Pittsburgh's air quality. She also received a bachelor's degree in environmental studies at the University of Pittsburgh, and she co-authored this report, the Categorical Review of Health Reports on Unconventional Oil and Gas Development in Pennsylvania. So we're going to start the video now, the first video, and then the second video is Mark Buckley, who is going to be doing questions and answers with us afterwards. And Mark Buckley is with the partner, he's the partner and senior economist that leads the natural resource practice at Eco Northwest, and they're located in Portland, Oregon. He designs and manages economic analyses typically involving water resources and land management. The majority of his work focuses on improving efficiency of investments in watersheds and water resources, including integrated planning and restoration, conservation, and also damage recovery. Mark serves as an expert witness on natural resource issues, and he's published research in peer-reviewed journals and other publications. And he is the lead author of The Economic Cost of Fracking in Pennsylvania. Okay, so we'll start out with the video from Frack Tracker Alliance.
There are a few main takeaways, and one of our major takeaways was that the literature on this issue has grown substantially just within the past 2 years, and along with that, the ratio of studies that found a positive association between unconventional oil and gas development and a health impact, adverse health impact, has also increased. So we looked through in total 142 studies, and 127 of them, which is 89%, found in some way that unconventional oil and gas development is associated with a health impact. And then we found that 70 of those studies, or roughly half, were related to Pennsylvania. So whether that's through sample populations, including Pennsylvanians, or using monitoring within the state of Pennsylvania, and any other way that the data was extracted from the state. And then 28 of our studies were focused specifically on Pennsylvania and the Marcellus Shale here. And of those 28 studies, 78% of them found evidence of a health risk. A second major takeaway from the report was that early life exposure, and including prenatal exposure, was the most studied topic. The research shows a link between unconventional oil and gas development and adverse birth outcomes and morbidity in children. Pennsylvania studies showed that unconventional oil and gas development is associated with low weight birth rate and preterm birth, and there is an epidemiologic link between drilling and early infant death. And another takeaway from the report was that health impact and exposure assessments focus primarily on air pollution. So local and regional air pollution, exposure to local and regional air pollution was the most widely acknowledged and also geographically widespread risk driver. There are several pollutants of concern. So for example, volatile organic compounds, VOCs, and hazardous air pollutants such as benzene were repeatedly shown to cause adverse health impacts in the literature. These can be released at different stages of the drilling process, from venting and flaring to fugitive emissions and evaporation from flowback pits. Acute and chronic non-cancer risk and acute cancer risk was found to be associated with occupational inhalation of VOCs from flowback pits in the U.S. Another pollutant of concern is particulate matter. Particulate matter is associated with silica-induced lung injury, respiratory illnesses, including asthma, and cardiovascular impacts, chronic neurological diseases in young children, and hospitalization rates of pneumonia. Also, exposure to silica sand from the very fine sand that's used as proppants to open the fissures of the shale gas rock also has associated health impacts. Retrospective health studies of workers who worked in industrial sand facilities showed high rates of silicosis from this work. And while these are retrospective health studies from before the onset of unconventional oil and gas development, they do indicate that exposure to silica from fracking is likely to be a contributor to silicosis in the future. In order to frack a well, it takes hundreds of trucks to carry in water and sand and equipment needed. Unconventional development involves these very large multi-well pads, and it takes millions of gallons of water and tons of sand and hundreds of different chemicals to hydraulically fracture a well. And all of that has to be brought in by truck, unless there is some, source of water on site. So all of these trucks and idling of the trucks and just traffic of the trucks is a huge contributor to air pollution. Impacts on mental health and well-being, including self-reported stress and worry about health, mental illnesses including depression, fatigue and sleep disturbances from noise and light pollution, general health symptoms, migraines and headaches, nasal and sinus symptoms. Hospitalization rates were shown to be increased for pneumonia among elderly populations, and also rates for hospitalizations regarding skin symptoms and diseases. Another source of health impacts is through groundwater contamination. The Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection officially acknowledges 335 cases of groundwater contamination associated with unconventional oil and gas development in the Marcellus Shale. We did notice a lack of studies that are looking at groundwater in relation to health impacts, which is likely due to the difficulties of tracking contaminants through groundwater transport. In Pennsylvania, an estimated 446,891 people live within a mile of a well, and 89,000 of them are under the age of 18. This is within a distance where the literature shows that there are adverse health impacts. And another important thing to note is that the way wells are spread out through the state, it's not uniform. Unconventional oil and gas development has the greatest impact in the northeast and southwestern portions of the state, with Washington County, Greene County, Bradford County, and Susquehanna County having the greatest number of unconventional wells. All of those 4 counties have over 2,000. In these 4 counties, in addition to Butler and Armstrong counties, the majority of the population, over 60%, live within 2 miles of a well. The results of this study clearly indicate that unconventional oil and gas development is impacting people's health. Furthermore, impacted communities clearly attribute declines in their health to unconventional oil and gas development. More high-quality epidemiologic studies are required to understand the exact causes of these health impacts, but that's not to suggest that the impacts aren't happening. They clearly are, and we're seeing it in the literature. So moving forward, we recommend that state agencies take a precautionary approach to unconventional oil and gas development and address these public health concerns before continuing to permit unconventional oil and gas wells. Our approach needs to acknowledge and accept as fact that residents' health is being impacted. And the current regulations that we have in place or the enforcement of these regulations isn't enough to protect our health. Permitting processes going forward need more public participation because the public obviously is being impacted, and this public participation needs to be meaningful. It can't just be, a box that's checked and then moved on. We need to listen to the concerns of residents because they are noting impacts in their to their health.
We're going directly into the next video, which is the economic cost of fracking in Pennsylvania with Mark Buckley.
The key factors, the takeaways that we had were that these costs, the subset of costs that we're actually able to identify and quantify attributable to fracking activities, does get us up into the millions of dollars a year, easily tens of millions, and talking about billions of dollars when we're looking at the cumulative effects over time. So we're talking about costs on society that are on the order of magnitude of the amount of employment associated with fracking. So as much as we hear about the benefits of fracking activity in terms of job creation in places like Pennsylvania, the subset of costs that we can identify and the subset of costs that we can actually put a dollar value on is up to that scale and probably quite a bit higher. I think as we walk through the consequences, the health effects, which have a lot of pathways to people in terms of groundwater, surface water, air quality. It's a little bit hard to tease out the specific chemicals and the specific pathways, but there is a preponderance of evidence that the actual statistical changes in health outcomes for communities that are close to high concentrations of wells are quite strong. We're looking at, in this report, where there are specific financial health expenses associated, but we all know that that's only a small piece of the puzzle. So, for example, if we're looking at the costs of hospital treatments for low birth weight children, that's one factor, but that's really minuscule in the scheme of what parents consider the overall consequences of having to worry about the health of their children. So I think I would also emphasize when we're walking through the cost that we're able to quantify here, this fact that we are trying to focus on where there's information available and dollar values available that we can associate with them, that we're probably missing some of the big consequences. Again, thinking about some of the specifics, sleep disruption, depression, we can quantify some of the effects of those adverse consequences via expenditures, lost workforce productivity. One of the situations that we're dealing with here is trying to trace these effects through to what people would really care about and how they can think about these consequences. So I think it's important, if you're looking at this report, this kind of information, is not to focus on the dollar values as much as to try to understand what the effects are and then recognize how the dollar values give us a sense of their magnitude, but recognize where the dollars don't tell us the whole story. So migraines are an example of an effect that we're seeing a pretty strong increase in the rate of migraine occurrence for people who live close to these wells. There's a whole range of potential disruptions in a community when you have this sort of temporary, very boom and bust kind of economic activity that comes in. So it's often very specialized. It's often difficult to fully incorporate or build in the local labor force, and when they do, it can have secondary consequences for other industries. If you're trying to achieve some level of economic development, you want some sustainability, and this is sort of the opposite of a sustainable industry when we're thinking about the actual drilling activity, the fracking activity itself. So it's often that there's a fair amount of crowding out in terms of housing, in terms of labor force, congestion, in terms of infrastructure, roads, wear and tear. And if you're bringing in people from outside the area, they're often disconnected. They don't have a local connection to the community. They don't have friends and family. There has been plenty of information around increases in crime rates, drug use associated with areas with this kind of temporary and non-local labor force that can come in. Big picture question about this sort of focus on a resource extraction industry and the kinds of jobs that it can encourage and the kinds of businesses that are affected by it in the positive ways in comparison to other economic development strategies for these areas. So if you've got non-local oil and gas businesses coming in, bringing in labor from outside the area, it's a short-term burst. They don't have any real commitment to the community, to the region, to the resources of the area, and there might be this short-term burst in spending that can have some temporary benefits. But if you're thinking about the long-term consequences in the area, we're seeing that property value goes down. People don't want to live near these wells. Other jobs are negatively affected. Tourism and just sort of general attraction in many of the region can go down. So you see these long-term negative effects on other industries and just the overall appeal of the region. That increasingly in the U.S., what communities are trying to do is compete for businesses that pay good jobs, that employ highly skilled workers, and those highly skilled workers want to live places where they can raise their family, where they feel like it's a healthy place, a safe place, a strong community. And so you've got problems whereby both existing businesses are going to be harmed through this activity, existing labor forces, but you're going to have a hard time attracting some of those more resilient long-term industry and skilled workforce that areas really want. I think there's also the long-term effects of this sort of boom and bust cycle for an economy in a region. There's something that we often see, especially in the Midwest, where I grew up in Ohio, where you've got areas that had boomed and the infrastructure, the downtown areas, the businesses all expanded dramatically around some single industry, and then when that industry goes away, there's a lost sense of community and a lost sense of economic vitality that can be very difficult to overcome. You see this in extreme cases like Detroit, where trying to step back from a build-out from a larger level of population and economic activity, and that can be very expensive and difficult to achieve, and people tend to leave in that situation. So there's a potential that fracking activity, especially in these counties that have had very concentrated well development, are going to have a long-term challenge to maintaining their community, their infrastructure, their baseline industries, their households, their housing supply. It can be very disruptive to housing prices when you've got big swings in overall population. In terms of the environmental consequences of this fracking activity in Pennsylvania, first of all, you have to understand what the the pathways are that fracking can affect the environment and habitat in Pennsylvania, that the well pads where the drilling actually occurs, from a surface area perspective, is a potentially large total area of landmass, particularly given that it's often in agricultural or even forested areas. So we're talking about probably around 100,000 acres or so that's affected directly. So there's direct disturbance there, not to mention all the traffic and the activity, the light, the noise, the sound, and its effect on wildlife populations in the vicinity. But then in terms of direct functions of natural capital, natural ecological systems in Pennsylvania, we'll see disruption from the surface activity as well as subsurface activity, and that's where things get complicated. So first of all, there's sort of some direct disturbance that can occur, and contamination from chemicals and disruption to the natural systems. But then we have a whole range of potential long-term bioaccumulative effects and contaminations of surface water, aquatic habitat, and then via some of the air pathways, we've got other contaminations of ecosystems in Pennsylvania, which can again have disruptive effects for birds, wildlife, fish populations, and there are recreational benefits associated with those. People in Pennsylvania care about having native wildlife that's healthy and active. Hunting and fishing is affected by those kinds of consequences. And ultimately, I think there's a potential loss of faith in the reliability of the resources that Pennsylvanians depend upon, their drinking water supply, their groundwater. We're already seeing that in terms of avoidance or averting behavior, where people are using more bottled water in Pennsylvania. People don't trust their groundwater wells. People are selling their homes. The effect on property value of being close to a fracking well, particularly if you rely on groundwater, is substantial, and we're talking about over $1 billion in property value that's been lost that way already, and probably more, because it's often hard to isolate those the whole set of consequences for willingness to pay for homes when you're in an area with all sorts of disruptions and potential unsafe environment for your family. Same effects of fracking that can translate through to negative consequences for public health can also affect the attractiveness of recreation opportunities and really demand both from residents and potential tourists. Recreational fishing in Pennsylvania is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and plenty of surveys have shown that people are not willing to go to parks, to go fish, to hunt in areas that are close to wells. They don't trust the effects, and it's generally a lot less attractive in terms of the environment. So recreation is an important industry as a whole. Outdoor recreation in Pennsylvania is an important industry as a whole, not just for the overall magnitude and the expenditures and the overall economic impact in the state, but it's also important to residents directly and some of the intangible benefits they have, from access to a clean, attractive environment, trails, streams, mountains, forests near where they live. And if they don't feel like those are safe places to go, or if they're just noisy and loud and being disrupted by drilling activity, that makes the place just less attractive as a place to live, to work. And so it also can translate through to business attraction, business retention, and workforce attraction and retention. So the agricultural industry has been affected already by fracking in Pennsylvania, not just in terms of removal of productive farmland from the overall land base for agriculture, but also in terms of contamination. There have been plenty of examples of spills, soil contamination, water supply contamination in Pennsylvania, and those are just the ones that have been identified. So again, there could be this taint effect whereby agricultural production from these areas is seen as unsafe, and demand could go away. People might not be willing to buy produce from these areas. And I think as we see potential increases in overall numbers of wells that are active and overall disruption, there could be these bioaccumulative effects that, again, are difficult to trace. But if there's even uncertainty around the safety, the demand and the prices that farmers in these areas are going to be able to get for their produce is going to be very uncertain. And I know if I was a farmer, I wouldn't want to be anywhere near a well. So just in summary, when I think about this report, which was really a review of existing information and data, it tells us that communities in Pennsylvania are affected by fracking in all sorts of different ways and at almost every level, that homes, that households, that individuals, that businesses, that local agencies, that regional environments, ecosystems, natural resources. There are ways that fracking can negatively affect all sorts of resources and members of these communities. So I think each community has to look at what fracking means in their community and whereby fracking could have negative consequences, and whether those risks are worth the potential benefits that might be advertised. There are going to be differences from one place to another. There are going to be situations where wells are directly affecting water supplies, are close to people. But even in the areas where we don't know that there's a direct connection, there could be this long-term effect. So if I lived in this area of Pennsylvania and I was looking at this report, I would use it as a checklist or even a starting point to start to think about all of the ways we would want to evaluate any proposed new drilling or continued drilling in my community.
This is Tracy Carluccio, Deputy Director of Delaware Riverkeeper Network again. Thank you for joining the webinar. So right now I'm going to introduce the two presenters who will be providing answers to your questions. And first we're going to have both of them unmute themselves so they'll be able to be heard. And I already did introduce Mark Buckley. I'll just briefly say that he is an expert in economic analysis and natural resource practice, and he is the lead author of The Economic Cost of Fracking in Pennsylvania by Eco Northwest, the one report that was issued by Delaware Riverkeeper Network, and the link is now in your chat box so you can download that report. The other speaker that we have to answer your questions is one of the main authors, Kyle Farrar of Frack Tracker Alliance. He's their Western Program Coordinator, and in that position, Kyle manages work in the West Coast region, focusing on extraction activities. He is a researcher and also a graduate of the University of Pittsburgh Graduate School of Public Health doctoral program. He co-authored Categorical Review of Health Reports on Unconventional Oil and Gas Development Impacts in Pennsylvania, the other report by Frack Tracker Alliance, this time commissioned by Delaware Riverkeeper Network. So please type into the chat box any questions you have. We did have a few that were emailed, so I'll start with those while you can type in any that you think of. I'll begin with one for Kyle. So, Kyle, this question is, how do you know if the reports that you reviewed were relevant to the Marcellus and shale in Pennsylvania? And were there many reports that looked specifically at Pennsylvania?
So the study was based around a methodology that categorizes existing literature, right? And so we used a categorization process to break down the studies into a number of different categories, upwards of 25 different categories, so that we analyze them a number of different ways. And one of them was which shale formation they were focused on, and in many cases, a lot of the studies actually focused on multiple shale formations. But for the epidemiological studies, this was a very important factor in the study. So we included this in the categorization, so we knew which communities were being studied, broken down not only by shale formation, but also by state, and then also by the community, whether it's looking at childhood cancer rates or asthma rates, or looking at asthma in the elderly, or and pneumonia rates. So we were able to really break down all these studies in the review into a number of different categories of sample populations that included the geospatial location of these studies.
Great. How many reports did you study, and what were the type of studies? Were they all health studies, or did they look at other sorts of impacts?
Very good. So we limited the analysis to journal articles that were peer-reviewed, although in certain cases we included white papers if they were if it was literature that was published by a state agency, or if it was published by a known legitimate source besides a journal article. And I'm sorry, can you repeat the question one more time? How many studies?
Were they mostly health studies that you looked at?
So the previous literature had specifically the Hayes and Shonkoff report of 2016, which analyzed literature up until 2016, looked at groundwater impacts, looked at air quality impacts, and looked at health impacts. Now, since the literature has grown so much since 2016, we limited the study just to health impacts. And there have been other reviews since then on air quality and groundwater quality. So we are filling in a specific gap here looking at health impacts. So we limited it to health impacts in order to really focus our attention on these issues. And that doesn't mean that the studies that were reviewed didn't also document impacts to air quality or document impacts to groundwater quality. We actually included notes on that within our categorization. So my background is in exposure science, risk assessment, in the fate and transport of chemicals and how they move through the environment. So this was of particular interest to me. So we documented studies that were able to identify the exposure pathway or hypothesize an exposure pathway as well. But our main criteria was to limit this to studies that are specifically investigating, that do investigate health outcomes. And our sample set was, give me 1 second, I can find it for you. Sorry, I don't have the total number in front of me. I know it was mentioned in the presentation, but I believe it was upwards of close to 130 studies, and then we also had and even 100 references that we included in the report as well, just because it's very important to talk about exposure pathways and the movement of chemicals and the movement of carcinogens and other risk drivers.
Right, great. And I think in the report you also zeroed in, because somebody has asked a question about how many studies cover the Marcellus. And I think in your report on page 8, you zero in on Marcellus development. And I think I read there was 70 studies in Pennsylvania, and then you looked more closely, focusing on the Marcellus development. What did you really find in terms of Marcellus development? Were the impacts different, or from other shale formations, or is it kind of uniform? Was there anything special that you learned looking at the Marcellus development papers?
Well, we learned a lot looking at the Marcellus development papers. One thing we learned was that the results and the health outcomes that are documented in the Marcellus can largely be ascribed to the majority of other shale plays as well. So the unique thing that we found out about the Marcellus is that it has been the primary focus of health effects literature. These reviews that are looking at health impacts, the majority of them have been done on the Marcellus as opposed to other shales around the country. So we took the majority of what we learned in the study actually was from the Marcellus, and the majority of the health impacts that are documented and that we have listed in the report are directly from the Marcellus. So, and that we find that in the other shale formations, we're also seeing very similar health outcomes. So, what we can largely interpret from this literature review is that health outcomes resulting from development in one specific shale formation, unconventional shale formation, can largely be considered to have an impact in other shale formations as well. And these health outcomes are not particularly limited to one geographical location, one shale formation.
Thank you. Someone has asked, why is it significant how close people are to extraction wells?
Yeah, this is a great question, because this was covered in a large number of studies in a number of different ways. Now, the primary source of exposure to contaminants that are being released by unconventional natural gas development, it's hypothesized that the major source is, the major mode of transport is through the air. Now, that's not to say that groundwater contamination is not an issue in certain areas, but the overwhelming amount of literature that is focused specifically on air quality shows that it has what we think to be the greatest impact on the greatest number of people. Now, it makes a difference the number of wells that are around you, because those are the sources that are of these air contaminants, of carcinogens, of the BTEX, benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, xylene, and other volatile organic compounds that are going to be the main risk drivers. They're also going to be the main contributors to smog and ozone in these communities regionally. And ozone is a major risk driver for asthma, as well as a number of other cardio and pulmonary disorders. So it's not only the distance to the well, but the number of wells around you. So a number of these studies looked at well density, the number of wells within a certain distance to a receptor site, which might be a home, might be a school, where people live, right? But also the distance to specific wells is incredibly important, because as the contaminants are released into the air, the contaminants are diluted, and the closer you are to the source, the less dilution within the atmosphere these risk drivers are going to experience. So you'll have higher concentrations the closer you are to the wells.
Okay, great, thank you. I have a question here for Mark. Mark, how do you know if the current trends that you found in costs are going to continue over time?
Well, I think it largely comes down on the health side to these factors that Kyle's been talking about. So proximity of people and these exposure pathways, and how resilient these chemicals are in the environment, and how long that contamination will be available to affect people. Now, I think there also is sort of a baseline level of costs imposed on society, but if we're seeing continued drilling, then there's a trajectory on that, an increasing rate, and we can think about how the total impact in an area will increase. And it's great having this work that Frac Tracker has produced to build upon. When we're trying to do an economic analysis, we're always looking for a good, quantitative, reliable scientifically defensible set of information about what the direct effects are, and then our job is primarily to look at what the values of those effects are, whether they're positive or negative to society. And so the per unit effects are something to think about, as well as the total magnitude. So I think chemicals in the environment, disturbance to the environment, and increases in total number of wells if drilling continues, permits continue. But then the value of those damages are largely tied to the scarcity of those kinds of effects on someone's health. Now, as we mentioned in the report, and I think I alluded to in the video, we don't have a full set of information in this case on what the total value of these negative consequences are to society, especially given the fact that fracking just hasn't been around in Pennsylvania that long. So we don't know what all of its, whether we're talking about health, environmental, economic, property, crime, etc. I think what we'll see is more information becomes available, which if we were doing this study again, we would be able to quantify more consequences. So I would say sort of the short of it is we're probably going to be stuck with these costs and residual costs for quite some time, and the total set of costs and the values that we're able to understand about those costs are probably only likely to go up.
Right. Thank you. Mark, this is also for you. How do you know the value of adverse health effects? Can you explain a little bit the analysis that you did? Also, I guess it would apply to environmental costs.
Yeah, sure. So we were relatively conservative in this context in terms of using illnesses that have values associated with them in terms of actual health expenditures. And that is distinct from, let's say, the total economic consequence, where there is some, there is discomfort, there is an overall loss of well-being that can come from these health effects, and there can also be long-term chronic consequences. So the values, the dollar values in this study are limited to estimates of actual expenditures, as opposed to an additive value, which would be how much someone is willing to pay to avoid that discomfort. And in other health consequences, we had a pretty large benefit cost analysis for the EPA and several regulated communities around a bacteria, TMDL, in Southern California, where we were able to get the health expenditures associated with gastrointestinal illness, as well as some solid survey-based willingness to pay values that help us understand the negative value, the cost of the experience of the illness. So these dollar values, again, are limited to the actual market expenditures associated with the illness, but do not include those non-market, but probably much more important total illness consequence. Now, I've got a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old, and when they're sick at night, there's the cost of giving them a little bit of ibuprofen or Tylenol, but in terms of the overall consequence of the illness, it's much greater than the $1 or $2 of a couple milliliters of medicine. So I think that's important to remember in terms of what the overall scope of these values are. And then on the ecological side of things as well, it can be difficult to fully quantify and monetize consequences for society in these complex systems that vary from case to case, context to context, watershed to watershed, and there are all sorts of factors at play. So we're limited to the components that we can isolate, and it is still, I think, an evolving field in terms of understanding what the full long-term comprehensive consequences are in terms of ecological function. But we have some information to understand ballpark values to society, but I don't think we have a good sense in the long term. And in terms of trends, this is probably an important place to think about trends, where value is largely driven by scarcity. And as these services and this habitat becomes more scarce, both as a function of total area and relative to the population as populations increase. Or with climate change, if we are going to see more forces threatening the function of these systems and the species that rely upon them, that if you have more scarcity and more vulnerable ecological systems and wildlife populations, then these effects can push past thresholds or tipping points more easily, and so then that incremental, that marginal consequence is more valuable again. So I think across the range of these, we don't have the kind of information that lets us understand the full consequence, but we probably understand enough about this in similar situations from elsewhere where we've had a longer standing data base to work from, that these consequences are probably just going to grow.
Yeah, I see it. We see in the report that you're talking about $1.5 billion in cost in Pennsylvania as a result of oil and gas development from unconventional shale formations, and $54 billion over 20 years. And when you look at that in the report, you do lay out what you can monetize, showing that those people who live within 2 miles of a fracked well, and those counties that have more people within 2 miles of a fracked well, end up bearing higher costs. But then you also show, and you make it clear in the report, that there are areas in the state that don't even have shale gas development, but they have costs as well, and that's kind of the big picture costs you're talking about, I guess. So, I mean, overall, just looking at the big picture here, is it fair to say that the costs, the higher costs, are being borne by those that have the closest proximity to individual gas wells or live in the middle of dense gas well shale fields, but that everybody in Pennsylvania is going to pay some price because of the other costs that you're talking about here that are long-term, such as climate change? Is that fair?
I would say that's fair, especially if we're thinking about the distribution of even some of these healthcare costs and how those ultimately hit people's pocketbooks. That some of that is going to be an overall public health consequence that is going to translate, whether it's through in health insurance rates or public expenditures. I don't think you can assume, given the magnitude and the fact that we have around 20% of the population within a range that matters, that pretty much everyone will feel these consequences in a financial way.
We have someone who asked, can we expect to see long-term and widespread damage similar to the link between coal and acid rain? And I'm thinking about things like groundwater pollution, drinking water pollution that may take years to materialize and be measured in a way that can be recognized, and other sorts of impacts that take time to build until they're actually measurable.
Maybe Kyle, I don't know if you'd want to take a shot at that one.
Sure. Well, I see someone else has actually brought up a question to radon, and that might be a good topic to actually consider here. The consequences to climate change, of course, are growing, and we know that. But in terms of these other impacts, there's a study in 2015 that was put out by Joan Casey et al. From Johns Hopkins, showing that radon has been increasing in Pennsylvania. It wasn't published during our study period, which was 2016 to present, but the study out of Johns Hopkins showed that radon was increasing throughout the state and increasing at much higher rates near unconventional natural gas development, specifically fracking in the Marcellus shale here in Pennsylvania. So, and remediation costs of radon, are known, very well known, and so you have this issue of the porosity of the formations continuously increasing, and then you have it is like radon, methane gas is going to also be transported into groundwater through the same pathways, through very similar pathways, as well as the formation fluids following it if the model is correct, which shows that as you increase pressure from fracking, you're going to be increasing the transmissivity of these of the layer between your groundwater and the Marcellus shale formation. And so the hypothesis is that these issues will continue to grow and continue to be larger economic issues, if we are going to be able to deal with them at all. Yep.
Thank you, Kyle. And just in terms of the other question that the person asked about widespread, I would just point that person to the section in the Eco Northwest report that talks about the costs of climate change, because those are the broad changes that we can expect that have already begun, but we can expect to continue and accelerate because of the release of methane, which is a greenhouse gas 86 times more powerful than carbon in warming the atmosphere. So the release of methane, I would just pose as a similar kind of driver of negative environmental impacts that would be similar to the widespread impacts that coal had because of the warming of the atmosphere and the fact that methane is going to accelerate and get us more quickly to the tipping point that we're warned about. As a matter of fact, Dr. Howarth of Cornell has recently made it a new report, and he makes it very clear that the leaks are accelerating. As a matter of fact, new measurements show that we're up to about 4.1% of methane leaks during the production of natural gas. And what that means is we're going to get to the 1.5 or 2% centigrade much, much quicker than was expected. And really the only way to address that problem is if we address the issue of methane, because since it does act more quickly on the environment, we can actually have an effect of slowing it down if we were to eliminate or drastically reduce the emissions of methane into our environment. But so at this point, I think we're about at the end. I don't have any more questions that have been sent in that have not been answered. But I would like to say that we have greatly have a lot of appreciation for both Frac Tracker and Eco Northwest and the reports that have been produced. We consider these reports to be of great significance in Pennsylvania, and our goal is to share the findings of these reports. And in order to do that, we have set up forums in Pennsylvania on May 22nd. There will be a forum at Lycoming College in Williamsport that's being hosted locally by Responsible Drilling Alliance, Keep It Wild, and the Clean Water Institute. And then on the next night, May 23rd, we're having a forum at the California University of Pennsylvania in California, PA. The local hosts there are Southwest Pennsylvania Environmental Health Project, Mountain Watershed Association, and the Center for Coalfield Justice. And we have some others that are coming up in the coming weeks as well. But at each of those forums, we'll have an interactive opportunity to discuss the actions that we need to take, because one of the things that we feel is absolutely essential is that this information be actualized, that it be realized by those who are in the decision-making positions, and that it's shared with people. So this comprehensive look at the economic impacts, including the external impacts that are usually passed on to the public, with the public being unaware of them, and the health impacts that some people who live in frac communities are already bearing the burden of, but a lot of people don't know what's happening. Those big costs, both in terms of health and economics, are understood much more fully and with the cold eye of scientific analysis, without any sort of political rose-colored glasses on. So in furtherance of the concept of let's take this information and do something with it is one suggestion that Delaware Riverkeeper Network would like to make. And we're posting a link to a resolution in the chat box now. And that resolution is in support of a moratorium on permits for unconventional oil and gas wells and well sites in Pennsylvania. It's been prepared by our attorney. And there's many pages of whereases to make a very strong case for why this resolution makes sense and should be adopted. But just to let you know the gist of it, we are asking in this resolution that the governor of Pennsylvania enact a moratorium on new permits for oil and gas until the issues that have been raised by the health report and the economics report have been fully addressed. And the resolution is for the governing body of a municipality or a county, or it even could be done by an association. It supports and encourages Pennsylvania Governor Tom Wolf to issue an executive order directing that the DEP issue no permit for the development of oil and gas wells in the absence of a comprehensive environmental assessment of any proposed unconventional oil and gas development. And we go on and give more details, and we base this on the Environmental Rights Amendment of the Pennsylvania Constitution and the fact that the actions that the government takes need to advance and comport with the Constitution. Our attorney has looked into this. We do believe it's perfectly legal and defensible for the governor to adopt an executive order, and we believe that we have provided the start of some very good information that can be the underpinning or the foundation for asking a municipality or an association to adopt this resolution for a moratorium. So that's one thing that Delaware Riverkeeper Network is suggesting. And when we go to forums, the organizations that are the local host will be making other suggestions for actions that they're taking in their community in order to address these inequities that fracked areas are already bearing the brunt of. So I want to thank you again to our speakers for participating. They've phoned in and had to deal with also, like all of us, some of the technical glitches, but I think that they provided really good feedback to the questions that people submitted. And we hope that if you are in one of the areas where our forums are going to be held, that you'll join us, because we want as many people as possible to come out and learn about this. And we will have the videos, but also we will have Mark Buckley available, and Brooke Lenker from Frack Tracker will be at these meetings. And they will be able to answer either Mark over the phone or Brooke in person questions. And then we'll be having a more lengthy interaction discussion to talk about the actions where we can actually use this information. So if there's any last minute things that folks want to type into the chat box, go right ahead and do that. This has been recorded, so the webinar will be available in the coming days on the Delaware Riverkeeper Network's site, but we will be emailing you the link to that to every person who has participated in the webinar here tonight. Also, once the forms are completed, the videos as standalones will be available through a link as well, and we'll be sharing those. So thank you, Mark, and thank you, Kyle.
Thanks, Tracy.
And thank you to everybody. Good night.